From the earliest days of his political rise, Adolf Hitler spoke of the Soviet Union not merely as a rival power, but as a mortal enemy destined for destruction. To Hitler, Bolshevism was a poisonous ideology that threatened the racial and cultural survival of Germany. He viewed communism as a Jewish conspiracy designed to weaken nations from within, a belief that fused racial hatred with political obsession. Long before German armies marched east, the war against the Soviet Union existed fully formed in Hitler's imagination. Yet ideology alone does not explain the scale of what Hitler was preparing. Beyond hatred, there was hunger for land, resources, and strategic security. Hitler believed that Germany's defeat in the First World War, its vulnerability in the interwar years, stemmed from a lack of self-sufficiency. Germany, he argued, was trapped in a world where its survival depended on imported food and raw materials. The solution, in his mind, lay in the vast territories of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Ukraine's fertile soil would become Germany's breadbasket. The oil of the Caucasus would fuel its armies. The forests, coal, and minerals of the East would sustain a continental empire. This vision was not improvised in 1941. It had been articulated years earlier in Mein Kampf, where Hitler described the need for Lebensraum, living space for the German people. Eastern Europe, populated by Slavs, whom he regarded as racially inferior, was to be conquered, colonized, and reorganized under German rule. The Soviet state, he believed, was an artificial construction that would collapse once struck decisively. Like a rotten structure, it needed only a single, forceful blow. By 1940, circumstances appeared to confirm Hitler's worldview. France had fallen in a matter of weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped annihilation at Dunkirk. Norway, Denmark, the Low Countries, and much of Western Europe now lay under German occupation. The Wehrmacht seemed invincible, its doctrine of Blitzkrieg rewriting the rules of modern warfare. Speed, surprise, and coordination between tanks, infantry, and air power had produced victories that stunned the world. For Hitler, these successes were not merely military achievements, they were proof of destiny. Each triumph reinforced his belief that boldness and willpower mattered more than caution or logistics. His confidence hardened into certainty. Where others saw risks, Hitler saw hesitation. Where generals urged restraint, he sensed weakness. The Soviet Union loomed next. In the autumn of 1940, even as Germany remained technically at peace with Moscow, Hitler began to shift his focus eastward. The Nazi-Soviet Pact, signed in August 1939, had been a tactical arrangement, never a true alliance. It had allowed Hitler to invade Poland without fear of a two-front war, while Stalin gained time to consolidate Soviet defenses. But for Hitler, the pact was always temporary. He regarded it as a pause, not a partnership. By December 1940, that pause was over. On December 18th, Hitler signed Directive No. 21 Operation Barbarossa. The order was breathtaking in its scope. The German armed forces were instructed to prepare to crush Soviet Russia in a short campaign, even before the conclusion of the war against Britain. The Soviet state, Hitler believed, would collapse in a matter of weeks. Moscow, Leningrad, and Ukraine would fall in rapid succession. The Red Army would be destroyed west of the Dnieper and Dwina rivers. There would be no prolonged struggle. The very language of the directive reflected Hitler's mindset. It assumed victory as a premise, not a possibility. There was no serious contingency planning for failure, no meaningful preparation for a long war of attrition. The campaign was envisioned as a gigantic extension of Blitzkrieg, a vast encirclement battle on a continental scale. As winter turned to spring in 1941, Hitler withdrew increasingly from the daily routines of government. He spent long stretches at his mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps, surrounded by a small inner circle. There, amid alpine isolation, he refined his plans. Maps of Eastern Europe covered tables and walls. He traced imagined advances with his finger, speaking confidently of collapsing Soviet armies and triumphant marches eastward. To outside observers, nothing appeared amiss. Diplomatically, Germany and the Soviet Union continued to trade. Raw materials flowed west, manufactured goods moved east. Soviet trains crossed German territory. Official statements maintained the fiction of cooperation. But beneath the surface, the greatest military buildup in history was underway. German divisions were quietly redeployed from France and the Low Countries toward Poland. Rail lines became arteries of war, carrying men, tanks, artillery, and supplies eastward. Entire formations were re-equipped for the campaign, new vehicles were issued. Maps of the Soviet Union, many outdated and incomplete, were distributed to officers. Training emphasized rapid movement and encirclement, the destruction of enemy forces rather than the capture of territory. Secrecy was paramount. The operation's scale required months of preparation, yet Hitler insisted that Stalin remain uncertain of German intentions until the very last moment. To preserve surprise, German forces near the border were ordered to behave as if engaged in routine maneuvers. Troops were forbidden from provoking Soviet border guards. Reconnaissance flights were sometimes curtailed to avoid alerting Moscow. On paper, the deception worked. Joseph Stalin was determined to avoid war. The Soviet leader had emerged from the 1930s deeply suspicious, haunted by the fear of encirclement and internal betrayal. He believed that the capitalist powers Germany, Britain, and France were locked in a struggle that would ultimately exhaust them all, leaving the Soviet Union stronger by comparison. His goal was time to rebuild the Red Army, time to modernize industry, time to prepare for an inevitable future conflict. Yet the Soviet Union of 1941 was far weaker than it appeared. In the late 1930s, Stalin had unleashed a series of purges that devastated the military leadership. Thousands of officers were arrested, imprisoned, or executed. Experienced commanders were replaced by politically reliable but often incompetent figures. Initiative was discouraged. Fear replaced trust. The Red Army, once admired by foreign observers, had become rigid and brittle. Stalin knew this. It was one reason he was desperate to avoid provoking Germany. Intelligence warnings poured into Moscow throughout early 1941. Reports from spies, diplomats, and even sympathetic German officers all pointed to an impending invasion. Dates were suggested, units were identified. Troop concentrations were noted, but Stalin rejected them, convinced they were British attempts to drag the Soviet Union into war. He believed Hitler would not risk a two-front conflict while Britain remained unconquered. This assumption, so logical on the surface, would prove catastrophic. As German troops amassed along the frontier, Soviet forces remained under strict orders not to respond. Defensive preparations were incomplete. Aircraft sat wingtip to wingtip on exposed airfields. Ammunition was locked away. Units were scattered and uncoordinated. Any commander who took independent action risked arrest. To Hitler, Stalin's passivity confirmed everything he believed. He saw a paralyzed enemy, incapable of decisive action. He mistook caution for weakness, restraint for incompetence. The apparent calm on the Soviet side reassured him that surprise had been achieved. By June 1941, nearly 4 million Axis troops were positioned for the assault. The German army, supported by Romanian, Hungarian, Finnish, and other allied forces, stretched across a front hundreds of miles long. The scale was unprecedented. Never before had so many men, machines, and weapons been assembled for a single offensive. And yet, for all its size, Operation Barbarossa rested on fragile assumptions. German planners believed the campaign would end before winter. Supplies were calculated accordingly. Winter clothing was not prioritized. Replacement equipment was limited. The Soviet Union was expected to collapse politically once its armies were destroyed. There was little consideration of what might happen if the state endured. Hitler brushed aside doubts. He had little patience for logistical concerns, which he viewed as secondary to will and aggression. In his mind, wars were won by daring. His generals, many of whom privately feared the risks, largely remained silent. The successes of previous campaigns had taught them that challenging Hitler could be dangerous and often futile. Thus, as dawn approached on June 22, 1941, Europe stood on the edge of transformation. The greatest invasion in history was about to begin, driven by ideology, ambition, and a belief in invincibility. To Hitler, victory seemed inevitable. The Soviet Union appeared unprepared, its leadership indecisive, its armies vulnerable. But beneath the surface of German confidence lay the first hints of disaster unseen, ignored, and growing stronger with every mile the Wehrmacht prepared to advance. As the German war machine prepared for its colossal thrust into the Soviet Union, Adolf Hitler confronted a strategic dilemma that threatened to undermine his grand design before it even began. Operation Barbarossa, for all its scale and ambition, depended on speed and concentration. The Wehrmacht would strike east with overwhelming force, shatter the Red Army near the frontier, and end the war before the Soviet Union could recover. But for such a gamble to succeed, Germany's flanks had to be secure. And in early 1941, the southern flank was anything but stable. The Balkans, long regarded as Europe's powder keg, once again became a focal point of great power politics. To Hitler, the region mattered not for ideological reasons, but for strategic necessity. Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary were aligned with Germany, providing crucial resources, particularly Romanian oil from the Ploiești fields. These oil supplies were vital to the German war effort. Any threat to them posed a direct danger to Barbarossa itself. Yet just south of this vital axis lay uncertainty. Yugoslavia occupied a pivotal position. Though formally neutral, its government had leaned cautiously toward Germany under intense diplomatic pressure. In March 1941, Yugoslavia signed the Tripartite Pact, aligning itself at least on paper with the Axis powers. To Hitler, this appeared to resolve the Balkan problem. The southern flank would remain quiet while German armies marched east. But the situation unraveled almost immediately. On March 27, 1941, a sudden coup d'etat in Belgrade overturned the pro-German government. The new leadership, supported by popular demonstrations and sympathetic to Britain, rejected alignment with the Axis. To Hitler, this was not merely a diplomatic reversal. It was a personal affront. He interpreted the coup as a British-backed act of defiance and betrayal. Worse still, it threatened to open the Balkans as a potential front, jeopardizing the security of Romania and the entire Eastern campaign. Hitler's response was swift and uncompromising. Within hours, he ordered the destruction of Yugoslavia as a state. There would be no negotiations, no gradual pressure. The country was to be crushed militarily and erased politically. This decision reflected a recurring pattern in Hitler's leadership: strategic impatience combined with emotional reaction. Rather than reassess priorities or seek containment, he chose annihilation. At the same time, Greece posed a related challenge. Italy, Germany's Axis partner, had launched an ill-prepared invasion of Greece from Albania in October 1940. The campaign had been a disaster. Greek forces not only halted the Italians, but pushed them back into Albania, humiliating Mussolini and exposing Axis weakness in southeastern Europe. British forces had begun to deploy to Greece, raising the specter of Allied airbases within striking distance of the Romanian oil fields. For Hitler, this was intolerable. He now faced a choice: proceed with Barbarossa and risk instability in the Balkans, or delay the invasion to secure the region. Speed was essential to his Eastern plan, but so was security. In the end, Hitler chose to intervene. Operation Merida, the invasion of Greece, was combined with the planned destruction of Yugoslavia. German forces were redeployed southward. Divisions that might have been training or positioning for the Soviet campaign were instead sent into mountainous terrain, preparing for a rapid Balkan offensive. On April 6, 1941, the assault began. German armies surged into Yugoslavia from multiple directions: Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania, coordinating a lightning campaign designed to overwhelm resistance before it could coalesce. The Luftwaffe struck Belgrade with devastating force, bombing the city repeatedly in a campaign intended to shock and terrorize. Yugoslav defenses, fragmented and politically divided, collapsed almost immediately. Within days, German armored columns were driving deep into Yugoslav territory. Resistance was sporadic and disorganized. Ethnic and political divisions within Yugoslavia further weakened cohesion. Some units surrendered without fighting. Others disintegrated entirely. On April 12th, Belgrade fell. Less than 2 weeks after the invasion began, Yugoslavia ceased to exist as a functioning state. The speed of the victory reinforced German confidence. Once again, Blitzkrieg appeared unstoppable. Simultaneously, German forces turned south into Greece. Advancing through Bulgaria, they bypassed the formidable Metaxas line, a series of defensive fortifications, by maneuvering through Yugoslavia. British and Greek forces attempted to mount a defense, but the imbalance was overwhelming. German air superiority, combined with rapid ground advances, shattered Allied positions. Athens fell on April 27, 1941. British forces evacuated what they could, retreating toward Crete. The mainland campaign was over in less than 3 weeks. From a purely military perspective, the Balkan campaign was a success. German casualties were relatively light. The region was brought under Axis control. The immediate threat to Romania was neutralized. Hitler could now turn his full attention eastward. But beneath the surface, the Balkan detour carried hidden costs. Time, above all, was lost. Operation Barbarossa had originally been envisioned as a spring campaign. Launched in May 1941, the Balkan operations pushed the timetable back. Troops and equipment were diverted southward, then had to be redeployed north and east once the fighting ended. Rail lines were congested, logistics were strained. Preparations for Barbarossa were compressed into a narrower window. Hitler dismissed concerns about the delay. He believed the Soviet Union was so weak that timing scarcely mattered. A few weeks, he assumed, would make no difference. Summer still lay ahead. Victory would come quickly, as it always had. This assumption would prove fatal. The Balkan campaign also masked deeper structural problems within the German war effort. While the Wehrmacht excelled at rapid, decisive operations, it was being asked to do too much, too fast. Each new campaign added strain to men, machines, and supply systems. Vehicles wore down, spare parts grew scarce. Crews and commanders were exhausted. Moreover, Hitler's decision-making style was becoming increasingly centralized. He intervened personally in operational details, issuing directives based on instinct rather than consultation. Success had taught him that his intuition was superior to professional military advice. The Balkan victories only strengthened this belief. Within the German high command, unease persisted. Some officers worried that the Eastern campaign was being rushed. Others questioned whether Germany could sustain operations across such vast distances. But these doubts rarely reached Hitler, or if they did, they were brushed aside. Meanwhile, in Moscow, events in the Balkans were watched with growing anxiety. The destruction of Yugoslavia and Greece demonstrated Germany's continued military dominance. Soviet leaders noted how quickly entire states could be erased. Yet Stalin clung to the belief that Hitler was still posturing, still maneuvering diplomatically. The Balkan campaign, he reasoned, proved that Germany was distracted, not preparing for an immediate assault on the Soviet Union. Once again, warning signs were misinterpreted. As May turned to June, German forces streamed back toward the east. Units that had fought in the Balkans were now repositioned along the Soviet frontier. The invasion force took its final shape. 3 massive army groups north, center, and south were assembled, each with its own objectives and ambitions. The die was cast. By early June 1941, Hitler had secured his southern flank and eliminated immediate threats in southeastern Europe. From his perspective, the path to the Soviet Union lay open. The Balkan states had fallen with stunning ease. Britain remained isolated. The Red Army appeared passive and unprepared. It was beginning to seem as though history itself was bending to Hitler's will, but the delay imposed by the Balkan detour had narrowed the margin for error. The window for a quick victory was shrinking, even as confidence soared. The Eastern campaign would now unfold under the pressure of time. weather, and distance forces that no army, however brilliant, could ignore indefinitely. As German troops moved into their final positions along the Soviet border, engines idling and artillery calibrated, the illusion of control remained intact. Victory appeared certain. The world braced itself for what was about to come. The greatest invasion in human history was only days away. In the early hours of June 22, 1941, the silence along the vast frontier between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was shattered. At precisely 3:15 a.m., artillery fire erupted across hundreds of miles. Searchlights pierced the darkness, the skies filled with the roar of aircraft. Operation Barbarossa, the most ambitious military offensive ever conceived, had begun. For Adolf Hitler, this moment represented the culmination of years of ideological obsession and strategic ambition. The invasion was not merely a military operation, it was a crusade. He believed the campaign would reshape Europe permanently, annihilate Bolshevism, and secure Germany's future as the dominant power on the continent. To his inner circle, Hitler spoke confidently of victory within weeks. The Soviet Union, he insisted, was a hollow shell. The initial German assault was devastating. The Luftwaffe struck first, launching massive surprise attacks against Soviet airfields at dawn. Rows of aircraft sat exposed, many still grounded by Stalin's strict orders not to provoke Germany. Within hours, hundreds of Soviet planes were destroyed on the ground. German pilots encountered little resistance in the air, achieving near-total air superiority almost immediately. This dominance allowed German ground forces to advance without fear of serious aerial interference. On the ground, the Wehrmacht moved with breathtaking speed. German infantry crossed the river Bug under covering fire, while panzer divisions surged forward along preplanned axes. The invasion front stretched from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. Never before had such a massive force been unleashed simultaneously. Three enormous army groups spearheaded the attack. Army Group North drove toward the Baltic states and Leningrad. Its mission was to secure the northern flank and capture the symbolic city that bore Lenin's name. Army Group Center, the most powerful of the three, was tasked with the advance on Moscow. Its armor formations were expected to destroy the main body of the Red Army in Belarus before driving eastward. Army Group South advanced into Ukraine, aiming to seize its agricultural wealth and industrial centers. The plan was elegant on paper, the execution in the opening weeks seemed flawless. Soviet defenses collapsed with alarming speed. Units caught unprepared were overwhelmed before they could organize. Communication lines disintegrated. Orders from Moscow were often contradictory or arrived too late to matter. Entire formations were encircled as German armored spearheads sliced deep into the rear, linking up behind Soviet lines. Within days, German panzer divisions had advanced more than 50 miles in some sectors. Roads clogged with fleeing civilians and retreating Soviet troops. Bridges fell intact into German hands. Ammunition dumps and supply depots were captured almost untouched. The speed of the advance left Soviet commanders stunned and paralyzed. Attempts at counterattack were disastrous. The Red Army launched hurried offensives against German spearheads, often without proper coordination or air support. Tanks were committed piecemeal. Infantry attacked without artillery preparation. In many cases, Soviet units advanced directly into German kill zones. Casualties mounted rapidly, with little to show for the effort. By the end of the first week, it was clear that the Soviet Union had lost control of the border regions. German forces dominated the battlefield. The pattern repeated itself again and again: breakthrough, encirclement, destruction. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the vast pocket formed near Minsk. As Army Group Center drove eastward, its panzer groups executed sweeping movements designed to trap Soviet armies between converging armored columns. On June 29th, German spearheads linked up east of Minsk, closing a massive encirclement. Inside, the pocket lay entire Soviet armies, hundreds of thousands of men cut off from escape. The scale of the victory was staggering. More than 300,000 Soviet soldiers were captured. Thousands of tanks and artillery pieces were destroyed or abandoned. German propaganda seized upon the triumph, presenting it as proof that the Soviet Union was already on the verge of collapse. Foreign observers were equally impressed. Many concluded that the war in the East would be over by autumn. To the world, Hitler appeared unstoppable. In some regions, German forces were even greeted as liberators. In parts of Ukraine and the Baltic states, resentment towards Soviet rule ran deep. Collectivization, political repression, and deportations had left scars. For some civilians, the arrival of German troops seemed to promise an end to Stalinist oppression. These early receptions further reinforced German confidence and the belief that the Soviet state lacked popular support. Yet beneath the surface of success, troubling signs were already emerging. German supply lines stretched farther with each passing day. Roads were poor, often little more than dirt tracks. Vehicles broke down under constant use. Horses, still essential to German logistics, collapsed from exhaustion. Fuel and ammunition had to be transported across vast distances over infrastructure never designed for such traffic. The Red Army, though battered, was not destroyed. While frontline units were annihilated, reserves existed deeper within Soviet territory. New formations were being raised. Factories, though not yet relocated, continued to produce. The Soviet Union's sheer size absorbed blows that would have crippled smaller states. Each German advance created new distances to cover, new areas to secure. Hitler, however, saw only triumph. Reports from the front fed his conviction that the campaign was unfolding exactly as he had predicted. Soviet resistance, he believed, was collapsing faster than anticipated. He dismissed warnings from some commanders about supply difficulties and the need to prioritize objectives. The Red Army, he insisted, was already beaten. What remained was to finish the job. This confidence began to influence his decision-making. German panzer commanders, particularly figures like General Heinz Guderian, argued for relentless forward momentum. They believed that Moscow was the decisive objective. If the German army could reach and capture the Soviet capital, they argued, the political and administrative heart of the Soviet Union would be destroyed. The war would effectively be won on the battlefield. Momentum favored this view. Army Group Center had achieved the greatest successes and faced the most direct route to Moscow. The road appeared open, but Hitler hesitated. His priorities were shaped not only by military logic, but by ideology and economic ambition. Ukraine's resources loomed large in his thinking, so did Leningrad's symbolic value. Rather than concentrate all effort on a single decisive thrust, Hitler increasingly considered diverting forces to secure flanks and capture economically valuable territory. This marked a subtle but crucial shift. Until now, German operations had been driven largely by professional military planning. As Barbarossa progressed, Hitler began to intervene more directly, issuing orders that reflected his own strategic instincts rather than the consensus of his generals. These interventions were not yet disastrous, but they introduced friction, delay, and confusion. At the same time, Soviet resistance began to harden. Stalin, though initially stunned into silence, was slowly reasserting control. Emergency measures were enacted, command structures were reorganized. Political officers were empowered to enforce discipline. The language of patriotic defense replaced ideological slogans. The war was reframed as a struggle for survival, not just for socialism. The Soviet Union had been caught off guard, but it was not collapsing. By early July, German forces had advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. Maps were redrawn daily. Front lines shifted eastward with dizzying speed. Yet the sense of inevitability that permeated German headquarters masked an uncomfortable reality. The campaign was becoming more complex, not less. The illusion of invincibility still held. German soldiers marched confidently, convinced that victory lay just ahead. Hitler remained certain that one final push would shatter Soviet resistance completely, but the conditions that had enabled Blitzkrieg in Western Europe, short distances, dense infrastructure, political collapse did not fully exist in the East. The Soviet Union was vast, resilient, and increasingly determined. As July unfolded, the German advance continued, but the first cracks in the facade were beginning to appear. Decisions made in this moment about where to advance, what to prioritize, and how to manage a war of unprecedented scale would shape everything that followed. The war still looked one, yet, for the first time, it was no longer unfolding entirely on German terms. As German armies surged ever deeper into Soviet territory, the psychological impact of Operation Barbarossa rippled far beyond the front lines. The invasion was not merely a military event, it was a geopolitical earthquake. In capitals across the world, leaders struggled to comprehend the scale and implications of what was unfolding. For Adolf Hitler, the opening weeks of the campaign appeared to confirm his most deeply held beliefs. For his enemies and even some of his allies, it marked the beginning of a struggle unlike any other. Nowhere was the shock greater than in Moscow. When the first reports reached the Kremlin in the early hours of June 22nd, Joseph Stalin refused to believe them. For months, he had dismissed warnings of a German invasion as provocation or deception. Even as Soviet border units were overrun and airfields destroyed, Stalin clung to the hope that this was some kind of localized incident or unauthorized action. The idea that Hitler had launched a full-scale invasion without a formal declaration of war seemed inconceivable. As the truth became undeniable, Stalin's confidence collapsed. For days, the Soviet leader withdrew from public view. Meetings were canceled, orders were delayed or contradictory. Senior officials later recalled an atmosphere of paralysis at the highest levels of the Soviet state. Stalin, who had ruled through fear and absolute authority, now appeared stunned by betrayal and unprepared for crisis. This moment of silence proved costly. The Red Army, already reeling from the initial blows, lacked clear strategic direction. Units fought bravely in many sectors, but coordination remained weak. Communications broke down. Front commanders, fearful of acting independently, hesitated to maneuver without explicit approval. It was not until July 3rd, more than a week after the invasion began, that Stalin finally addressed the Soviet people. His radio broadcast marked a turning point not militarily, but psychologically. Gone was the aloof dictator speaking in ideological terms. Instead, Stalin appealed to patriotism, history, and survival. He framed the conflict as a great patriotic war, invoking memories of past invasions and calling upon citizens to defend the motherland at all costs. The Soviet Union, he declared, would fight on. While Moscow struggled to recover its footing, the reaction in London could not have been more different. For Winston Churchill, the German invasion of the Soviet Union was a grim vindication of his long-standing warnings about Hitler. Yet it was also an opportunity. Britain, battered but unbroken after a year of war, was no longer alone. Germany had opened a vast new front, committing the bulk of its military power to the east. Churchill acted immediately. On the very day of the invasion, he addressed the British nation, setting aside years of bitter hostility toward communism. Ideological differences, he declared, were irrelevant in the face of Nazi aggression. Any nation fighting Hitler would receive Britain's support. The enemy of Germany was Britain's ally. Diplomatic channels between London and Moscow were opened with remarkable speed. A British mission was dispatched to negotiate cooperation. Though Britain's capacity to offer immediate military assistance was limited, the political significance of the alliance was immense. Germany now faced the prospect of a prolonged, multi-front war, the very scenario Hitler had always sought to avoid. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the German advance continued relentlessly. By early July, Army Group Center achieved yet another massive encirclement west of Minsk, capturing hundreds of thousands more Soviet soldiers. The scale of Soviet losses was unprecedented. Entire divisions vanished from the order of battle. Roads were clogged with prisoners marching west under guard. German officers reported that the enemy appeared to be disintegrating. These victories reinforced the belief within German headquarters that the campaign was nearing its decisive phase. Panzer commanders pressed for permission to exploit their success fully. General Heinz Guderian, commanding one of the key armored groups, argued passionately that momentum must not be lost. The path to Moscow, he insisted, lay open. Soviet resistance was chaotic. If the armored spearheads were allowed to push east without delay, the German army could reach the Soviet capital before the enemy had time to regroup. Too many professional soldiers, the logic was compelling. Moscow was not only the political heart of the Soviet Union, it was also its primary communications hub. Rail lines radiated outward from the city. Administrative control, industrial coordination, and symbolic authority were all concentrated there. The fall of Moscow, many believed, would deal a crippling blow to Soviet morale and governance, but Hitler's perspective was shifting. As reports flooded in from the front, Hitler fixated increasingly on geography and resources rather than operational tempo. Ukraine's agricultural wealth and industrial capacity drew his attention. So too did Leningrad, a city heavy with ideological symbolism. Hitler began to view the campaign not as a race to a single decisive point, but as a series of objectives to be secured methodically. This divergence between Hitler and his generals marked the beginning of a profound transformation in German command dynamics. Until now, Hitler had largely allowed the Wehrmacht's professionals to conduct operations. Success had reinforced his confidence, but it also encouraged him to intervene more directly. He believed his strategic instincts had been proven correct time and again. The generals, in his view, thought too narrowly, clinging to outdated concepts of warfare. By July 1941, Hitler was increasingly issuing directives that reshaped the campaign's priorities. Armored units were ordered to support infantry operations or divert toward secondary objectives. Advances slowed as forces were redirected. The razor-sharp focus of the opening weeks began to blur. At the time, these decisions did not appear catastrophic. German armies were still advancing. Soviet losses continued to mount. The Red Army seemed incapable of mounting a coherent strategic defense. To outside observers and even to many within Germany, it still looked as though nothing could stop Hitler. Yet beneath the surface, the first strategic crack had formed. The German war effort was now being pulled in multiple directions. Momentum, the lifeblood of Blitzkrieg, was no longer absolute. Supply problems intensified as routes lengthened and priorities shifted. The Soviet Union, battered but not broken, gained precious time to reorganize, mobilize reserves, and prepare defenses in depth. Most importantly, Hitler had begun to override the very principles that had brought him victory. The illusion of invincibility remained powerful, but it was increasingly detached from reality. Each new order reflected confidence not only in German strength, but in Hitler's personal judgment. The campaign that had begun as a bold gamble was slowly transforming into something more rigid, more centralized, and less adaptable. As July drew to a close, the war in the East stood at a crossroads. German forces had achieved triumphs on a scale never before seen. The Soviet Union had suffered losses that would have destroyed any other state. To the world, Adolf Hitler still appeared unstoppable. But history was already turning. It was beginning to look as if nothing could stop Hitler. And yet, he was about to make his first major strategic blunder.